Alright, so today I want to cover 10 things that you can look for to determine if your pet snake could possibly have an illness. And before we jump into it, I have to say I am definitely not a veterinarian, although I do work closely with some veterinarians. But a lot of this stuff has been pretty much a crash course when I jumped into keeping and breeding ball pythons about 5 years ago. I've actually had some other snakes, some king snakes, and a couple of reticulated pythons. And let me tell you, when it comes to snakes, they can be pretty bulletproof compared to most other animals. They don't really get sick that often, and they very rarely will actually pass away from any kind of an illness compared to a lot of other animals. I've actually had quite a few animals here on my farm. I've had dogs and cows, rats and mice, and chickens and ducks, and let me tell you, it seems like the ball pythons and snakes in general are just really resistant to getting any kind of disease, but it can happen once in a while. I actually made a list of 10 things to look for when you're trying to determine if you need to bring your snake to the veterinarian. And the first one you want to look for is wheezing in your ball pythons or other pet snake. And essentially what wheezing is, it's actually a respiratory infection. And a lot of times you'll hear them, every now and then you'll hear them wheezing or making some sounds. Sometimes you'll hear every single breath in a snake in really severe cases where they make like a wheezing sound, almost like they have asthma or something. And that is definitely not a good sign. And let me tell you, if you have any kind of a sound coming from your snake, you should definitely take that snake to the veterinarian. I'd say it's probably a respiratory infection in most cases, and a lot of times the veterinarian can give them shots. Believe it or not, you can actually take a syringe and a needle and inject antibiotics into a snake. That's how they do it in most cases to clear up respiratory infections. Alright, so number 2 is regurgitation, and this one's a little bit tricky because some snakes will regurgitate because they have some issues. They can actually be sick, they can have some parasites or protozoa or something like that, but I'd say in most cases when a ball python or other snake actually throws up their meal after they eat it, it's usually the fault of the keeper, I'd say in most cases. As a matter of fact, I've had some ball pythons regurgitate, and it's usually my fault in a lot of cases. And when I first started, I didn't really know anything about regurgitation. There's a couple things that you can do unintentionally to accidentally get your snake to regurgitate. One of them is feeding too big of a meal. So if, a lot of people will say pretty much the biggest size meal you want to feed a snake is a rodent that is pretty much as big as the thickest part of the ball python. And if you actually increase that and feed them a really big rodent, something really massive, sometimes they will actually eat it, and then they find out that they can't handle it and they'll regurgitate it. I've actually had one hatchling, I think about 4 years ago, I actually did this mistake. And it's funny, you make these mistakes and you're like, all right, I'm never gonna do that again. And I actually fed that hatchling some of my leftover rodents from some of my other snakes that wouldn't eat it. I was going through feeding all my snakes, and I was like, all right, I have a few left over. I'm gonna double up and triple up. And one of my hatchlings, I fed 4 mouse hoppers pretty much back to back within just a couple hours, and that ball python, the hatchling, regurgitated that meal. So you definitely don't want to overfeed them. Another thing is if you actually feed your ball python or other pet snake and then you handle it right after feeding it, a lot of times that'll initiate regurgitation. I've actually seen here in my collection, if I feed my ball pythons and then I pair them up, a lot of times just the act of pairing the males and the females during the breeding season, if I pair them up too soon after a feed, a lot of times they'll regurgitate. As a matter of fact, the last regurgitation I had, I fed one of my female ball pythons, one of my female breeders, and it was about 4 days after I fed it, and she was stuck in the shed, stuck really in a deep shed. I was like, all right, it's been 4 days since she ate her last rodent, so I'm going to take her out and soak her in the sink and work on this stuck shed. And sure enough, she actually regurgitated. And usually when you walk into a reptile room or where you keep in your pet snake, a lot of times you can hear if they're wheezing, and if they regurgitate, you can smell it pretty much right off when you walk into the room. So that's another thing you really want to kind of pay attention to when you're walking into your snake room. You want to listen and you want to smell to see if anything is wrong in your reptile room. All right, so number 3, sores on the face. And if you actually take a look at Bobby here, pretty much I've actually had my big reticulated pythons will have sores on the face. And this is Bobby. He is my 7-year-old bamboo ball python, and he's in perfect condition, no problems at all. But a lot of times with big snakes, like a big reticulated python, you'll see right on the face, usually right on the nose, they'll have some sores, and that is from pushing on their enclosure. And there's no sores on Bobby. He's perfectly fine. Bobby's been perfectly healthy ever since I've had him, no problems at all. But usually with your reticulated pythons, what actually happens is something is wrong in the enclosure and they want to get out, and they just keep pushing and pushing. And the problem is, especially with your really big snakes, is they have a lot of power in the body of the snake, and they can really push really hard, and a lot of times they'll really damage their face and their nose, and you'll see the whole body of the snake and everything is perfectly healthy. And they'll sometimes, when they first start pushing, you'll actually see just a little redness on the nose of the snake, and that's when you really got to pay attention and fix something that can really leak. A lot of times I've actually seen them where if they keep pushing and pushing, they'll really mess up their face, and it turns into an infection, and they can get kind of mouth rot and stuff like that on their. So what I'd actually do is, if you see any of the snakes pushing really bad to where they're really damaging their face, I would definitely look at the conditions. Sometimes the temperature will be too hot, sometimes the temperature will be too low, sometimes you'll have too much humidity in there. And with my reticulated python, it seems like, my enclosure is just a little bit too small, and she doesn't really like it sometimes. So what I do is, when I first see her pushing, what I'll do is I'll take her out and I'll stretch her across the basement and just kind of let her stretch out a bit. She's actually 17 feet long, which is a really big snake. She weighs almost 100 pounds. She's a monster. And let me tell you, just stretching that snake out, I actually have 2 different enclosures. I move her back and forth and let her stretch out. And I'm always keeping an eye on her if she is pushing and kind of starting to mess up her face, or just getting a little red nose, or if I just look over there and she's pushing on the glass, I'll definitely take her out. And if you actually go down the road to where it gets really bad and you get an infection, or they start messing up their face, you definitely have to bring it to the veterinarian. All right, so number 4, you want to watch for discharge from the mouth. Sometimes you'll see slime on the sides of the tub, and sometimes they'll actually have a swollen mouth, and that is usually from a bacterial infection or a respiratory infection that you'll see. And a lot of times you'll see almost like bubbles coming out of the sides of the mouth of your pet snake. And kind of the weird thing is, when I first got my reticulated python, well, she's probably, I'd say maybe 6 months old. She's probably about 30 pounds, still pretty small as far as reticulated pythons go. And kind of the weird thing is I actually fed her a rodent, and when I fed her that rodent, all this liquid came out of her mouth, and I was like freaking out. What in the world is going on with my reticulated python? It was all bubbling and just kind of this watery stuff coming out. Come to find out, I'm pretty sure, 99% sure, what was actually going on, she was over at the water bowl drinking water right before I fed her that rat. So her whole mouth and her whole stomach was all full of water, and then when I fed her that rat, all that water just came out when she bit that rat. So sometimes you have to watch, all right, are these snakes actually drinking water before I feed them? Is that why it's coming out? Or do they actually have some kind of a problem where I have to bring that snake to the veterinarian? All right, so number 5 is red sores on the belly. So you definitely want to take a look at your belly of your snake. And quite often, I'd say every time you clean the snake, you want to pick it up and kind of do an inspection of your snake. You want to look at the belly. I've actually heard in really humid climates, some people will have scale rot, and the scale rot is, I think it's a bacterial infection that gets on the belly of the snake. I've never really had it here in my collection because it's so dry here in Colorado. And I've actually heard a lot of people over on the reptile forums, especially if they get a new snake, a lot of people will accidentally, inadvertently use a heat rock for a pet snake. And let me tell you, you don't want to use a heat rock because the heat rocks get way too hot. And I've actually seen people burn the belly of their ball python or other snakes using a heat rock. So a lot of times you actually, you can use some kind of a disinfectant. So pretty much for, like general wounds and stuff like that, what I actually use is I use a little povidone iodine diluted in water and heat it up to about 85 degrees, and I'll give them a bath for just a few minutes, and that really helps to disinfect anything. So if you actually have like any kind of a rodent bite or any kind of a scratch, as a matter of fact, on one of my big tubs I had a sharp edge on one of my boa tubs when my snake crawled out and around the corner and got on a sharp edge outside of the tub, and then kind of scraped them a little bit. It was my big reticulated python, and I used some povidone iodine on that to kind of clear that up. And it's pretty much a universal disinfectant. I use it on all my animals, and that's actually had a llama with some cancer at one point, and I was actually squirting on povidone iodine water as directed by the vet to cure that big gaping hole after they cut out the cancer. I was out there every day putting bandages on it, and let me tell you, it was kind of crazy. But a lot of the veterinarians will recommend using povidone iodine with water as a general disinfectant. All right, so number 6, another thing you want to look for is black spots or red spots on your pet snake or ball python. And essentially what that is mites. You'll actually get an infestation of mites, and the mites will burrow in between the scales of the ball python. And I had mites about 5 years ago when I first started. I didn't know what a mite was, and they get everywhere and they multiply like crazy. It's really hard to get rid of them too. It's maddening bringing mites into your collection. And mites can be kind of tricky because you can go do like a reptile show or some kind of a pet store or something like that, and the mites can actually crawl up on your clothes and hitch a ride into your reptile room. And a lot of times that is how you get mites, so you have to be really careful. A lot of people actually recommend, if you're going to a reptile show, to take all your clothes off, throw them in the dryer or the washer, wash all your clothes, dry them on high, and then take a shower to make sure you don't bring any mites into your reptile room. It's kind of crazy. And essentially what the mites do is they burrow in between the scales. So when I first had mites, I actually saw little black spots on my snake, and I couldn't rub them off. It was kind of weird. At first I thought it was just one of the patterns of the ball python. I was like, I don't remember seeing those spots. Maybe it was always there. And then what they do is they come out from between the scales and move to another spot on the snake, and they leave behind little tiny red sores. So you see a lot of little black spots, and you'll see little red sores, especially if you have a white snake. You can definitely see it really obvious. Or if you see like little bugs crawling around there, like little tiny microscopic bugs, those are little tiny mites. You definitely have to be careful of those. All right, so number 7 is stargazing. And when we think of stargazing, most people, I'd say, think of the genetic defect that's associated with some spiders. It's actually kind of a head wobble, some people call it, and it's where they kind of lose their equilibrium. Sometimes you can see them lifting up their head or turning it sideways, and they really can't see kind of up. They can't figure out up from down. Sometimes they kind of tilt their head at a weird angle. And stargazing is associated with some genes, but it's also associated with some diseases. There's actually, it's actually called IBD, inclusion body disease, that is really, I'd say it's more common in boa constrictors, but I've actually seen some people kind of warn me about boa constrictors. They say, hey, you probably shouldn't bring boas in with your ball pythons because boas have a higher tendency to get the IBD, and you can actually transfer it to your ball pythons. And from what I've heard, I've actually seen some videos of it online, and it looks almost exactly like the spider wobble, where they're kind of moving their head kind of at that weird angle, and it's really super contagious, and in pretty much all cases, as far as what I've heard, it is fatal. I've actually heard of some people getting IBD in their ball python collection and getting completely wiped out, where it goes through their whole collection and kills every single snake in their collection. Let me tell you, that would be absolutely devastating, getting something like that. So I'd say if you have one ball python that has, got a head wobble, maybe it's increasing over time, I'd definitely keep an eye on it, especially if it starts spreading to other snakes and you get more and more snakes with a head wobble or the stargazing. Then I would really be concerned about what's going on with your collection. All right, so number 8's a little bit tricky, especially with ball pythons, and that is not eating and loss of weight. I've actually seen a lot of people, they're talking about illnesses and snakes, and that's usually one of the things that comes up. And with ball pythons, it's usually perfectly normal that they go on a really long fast. I've had ball pythons that'll just absolutely refuse to eat for months at a time, and for whatever reason, they just come back on food and then just start eating, and within just like a couple months, they get really big and fat from eating every single week. It's kind of maddening with ball pythons. And with other snakes, I'd say if you have a problem with eating, I'd probably really keep an eye on it. I'd say in a really extreme case where they don't eat for a really long time and they get really kind of where they're wasting away, I would definitely bring that snake into a veterinarian to have it checked out. I'd probably get some kind of a stool sample. As a matter of fact, if you actually had a snake that didn't eat for a really long time and you're kind of worried about it and they went to the bathroom, I'd probably collect it, maybe bring it into a veterinarian so they can look at it under the microscope, kind of see what's going on there. All right, so number 9, losing scales. And a lot of times you'll actually have snakes that will shed. And a lot of people kind of confuse the shedding with losing the skin versus losing scales. And I've only ever had one snake that has lost scales. I actually had a king snake that, for whatever reason, I don't know what's going on with that king snake. It was one of my very first snakes. I didn't know anything about snakes, and for whatever reason, it just started falling apart and losing all its scales. And later, it actually died, which is kind of the weirdest thing. And I've actually seen people, if you kind of burn the belly of the ball python on a heat rock or something like that, I've actually seen some scales fall off. But let me tell you, if you're losing actual scales on the snake, that is a serious health issue, and you definitely need to bring it to a veterinarian as soon as possible. All right, so number 10, this is a little bit iffy too. Your snake could be lethargic. And let me tell you, with ball pythons, I'd say usually ball pythons, they don't move much and they're pretty lethargic. Although I have had one snake that was lethargic, and I thought for sure that snake was gonna die. And it was when I had my mites. I was trying to treat my mite infestation here in my reptile room, and I was using this, I can't remember what it was called. It was some kind of a wipe-on chemical that you were supposed to wipe on the snake, and it worked really good. As a matter of fact, this was a white snake, and I was wiping on this, I can't remember what it was called. I think it was, I can't remember what, I'd have to go back and look it up to see what the chemical was as far as that, but I was wiping it on that snake, and all the mites would pull out of the scales and start crawling all over the snake, and all the mites would die, and it worked really well. The problem is I was actually applying that chemical more often than the recommended directions on the bottle, which was a mistake. You definitely want to follow the directions to the letter. And I got to the point where that snake, I treated him multiple times in a row over a period of like a week. You're only supposed to do it like once a week. And I was like, I just need to get rid of all these mites. And I was kind of ignoring the directions. And let me tell you, that snake got super lethargic where I'd pick it up and it was almost limp. I thought for sure that snake was going to die. So let me tell you, if you're using any kind of a chemical on a snake, you definitely want to follow the directions to the letter. Or better yet, if you can, bring it to the veterinarian. And it's always kind of tricky trying to figure out, all right, do I want to bring the snake to the vet, or do I, want to try to treat it myself? That's kind of one of the big things, especially working on a really big scale like I am with a lot of different animals. As a matter of fact, I actually had one of my dogs that was pregnant with, was going to have some puppies, and I kept bringing that dog back to the veterinarian over and over. I thought for sure there was something wrong with that dog, and the veterinarian finally said, all right, you don't have to bring that dog in anymore. It's perfectly fine. She's going to have puppies just fine. And kind of on the flip side, I actually had a milk cow. Her name was Iris. As a matter of fact, I actually made a video of it way back a few years ago. It was one of my very first videos when I was doing a lot of cow stuff on my YouTube channel, and that cow actually had milk fever. She had a calf, a brand new calf just came out, and you can actually get milk fever from milk cows, which is a calcium deficiency. And I didn't know anything about milk fever or anything about dairy cows and the whole problem with the calcium deficiency. Come to find out, if you don't catch it in time, the cow will die, and you have a really narrow window of like 24 to 48 hours that you actually have to do an IV of calcium solution into the cow. And by the time I called the veterinarian, it was already, I think it was 2 days pretty much. It went from a really healthy looking cow to like skin and bones and would not eat at all for 2 days straight and completely wasted away. I was completely floored that a cow could change that fast. And come to find out, it actually passed away. So sometimes you have to be really quick on a lot of these diseases, and sometimes you don't really have to worry about it. I think it just takes practice as far as, you know, what you're going through and your experience with some of these diseases. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.